The High Dynamic Range technique, HDR for short, involves taking a series of images with different exposures so we can capture the best of both highlights and shadows. Now this goes hand in hand with automatic exposure bracketing. Here in Bridge we have 3 images. This one is the camera's exposure choice. This one is double the exposure, which we usually refer to as +1 stop. And this one is half the exposure, -1 stop. With HDR, we're not limited to 3 exposures or the 1 stop difference in exposure that I have here. With the control key held, I can select all 3 of these images, hit the enter key, and they'll all open up into Adobe Camera Raw. I can select any one of these to view, but if I want to select all 3, Control A is a nice easy way to do that. Then we just need to right click over any of these thumbnails and choose Merge to HDR. Now typically we would shoot images from a tripod for HDR, but this Align Images tick box is pretty good. And in actual fact, I handheld all 3 of these shots. All we need to do is to just take reasonable precautions to keep the camera as still as we can when we're capturing the shots we require. The Apply Auto Settings box is also a good one to keep ticked, simply because we're not locked into those settings. We can change them at any time through the process. I've set the deghosting feature to high. This is associated with subjects that have moved slightly between exposures, and as these were all handheld, that's almost a certainty. Now we need to click Merge, and we're given a name for the HDR. We can change it, but I generally stay with what I'm given. You can see it's clearly labelled -HDR. And when I click Save, a 4th thumbnail is going to be created on the left-hand side. Now we could proceed from here and start the manipulation of the HDR image, but we don't have to. We could click Done. It'll all close down, but if I take you back into Bridge, there you'll see the HDR is there. Now we can open this up at any time with a double click, and we'll be straight back into Adobe Camera Raw. The image is in fact a raw file, and we can start the manipulation process. HDR extends the tonal range of what our camera captures in one shot, and it brings us closer to how we see the scene with our own eyes. In the early days, HDR did get some bad press because the results were a little unreal, and they didn't suit most of the images we were shooting, giving a hit and miss sort of feel to the technique. That's certainly not the case now, and when you consider here that we've got a pretty good result with auto HDR processing, slow shutter speeds, and handheld images, and they were far from in register. But Photoshop is now pretty good at aligning images together. Now I can't complete the manipulation of this image in a 5-minute video, but what I can show you is what less than 10 minutes will create. It also needs to be recognised, I think, that digital technology is closing the gap with regard to dynamic range, both in the camera and our ability to deal with it in something like Photoshop or Lightroom. My Canon R5 mirrorless is much better with shadow detail than my previous camera, which was a Canon 1DS Mark III. Now I used that for about 14 years until recently. Here's an image that I shot with the Canon 1DS around 2007. It was given a 3-image HDR treatment to retain the highlights and the shadows. Look at how the HDR process has held those tires and also the reflections in the glass and the shiny bodywork. Here's another image taken at Duxford in the UK where 7 bracketed images were used. Now, I would argue here that that was a little bit of an overkill and a bit of an experiment, but certainly it hasn't done any damage at all. Now, I use the HDR process on an as and when basis, when I think it may be an advantage. Just another string to our bow. I'll see you next time.